After you play with the techniques I demonstrate and are wondering where they might take you, I want to take a moment to show you one of my landscapes that utilizes lost and found edges to create a very fun painting. Look closely and note the soft and hard edges within the foliage areas and also in the brush, and how simple layering and glazing of color can create interesting bark on the tree trunks without overdoing detail. Artists use several methods to coax the viewer's eye to move in a certain way through a painting. The most important is composition, but the artist can also use value, the lights and darks in the painting, as well as soft and hard edges to direct the viewer to see what the painter intends to emphasize. Our subject today is leafy trees, and in this exercise I don't plan on setting out to complete a landscape. We're going to start small by first looking at the structure of trees and then the techniques I often use to create relaxed, natural appearing foliage. So first structure, then foliage, then moving on to bark on the trunk, and then finally grounding our tree. In the future videos, we'll be putting together what we learn here and create our own original landscapes. For today, let's take a look at what supplies I'll be using and what you might think about having on hand. For today's demonstration, I'll first be using a piece of sketch paper that I'll be drawing my sample trunks and possibly a few limbs to get an idea of how I want my finished painting to look. When I'm ready for my painting, I will be doing my next sketch onto a piece of watercolor paper. This is a quarter sheet, which measures about 11 by 15 inches, of 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. I have my tape ready. I'll be taping my paper down to the board because I'll be picking it up and moving and getting some movement in that wet paint. Here's my number 2 pencil. And you'll also be needing a small paper towel or cloth towel to dry your brush, a piece of test paper to test the color and the value of your paint mix, and 2 containers of clear water, one to mix with your paint and one to clean your brush. The brushes I'm going to be using are either a number 10, 12, or even a number 16 round brush. Use the largest brush possible in order to get that wet paint on there in a sufficient amount. I'll also be using a number 8 round, and you'll be needing either a very small round or a number 2 or 3 rigger brush to get those tiny branches at the end of the limbs. The colors I'll be using are sap green, ultramarine blue, Hansel lemon yellow, raw sienna, burnt sienna, and alizarin crimson. If you're feeling adventurous, have some salt at hand. This is simply table salt, and when sprinkled into wet washes can sometimes yield very interesting textures. You could also use instant tea. This is instant tea with no sweetener, sugar, or lemon added. I always suggest that you have the supplies that you anticipate you're going to need right at hand. Now let's return to discussing the basic structure of many deciduous trees. The structure of trees is quite simple, especially if you think of a tree as a human stick figure, without a head of course. Torso, arms, and fingers would be equivalent to the trunk, limbs, and branches. Avoid creating what we call lollipop trees. They look stiff and artificial, and it's one good reason to be aware of the structure of a tree before beginning with painting the foliage. You don't always have to see that underneath structure, but be aware and even sometimes sketch it in. Often people tell me that although they thought trees would be very easy to paint, they were often disappointed with their attempts. Become an observer of the trees around you, especially in winter when most deciduous trees are bare. You can also oftentimes find handouts from organizations that will show you different trees and their structure and how they form. They're not all perfectly round. There's often an oval and even some real strange inconsistencies that make trees so wonderfully unique. Be aware of a few general things. Usually the trunk is larger at the bottom and then gets narrower. Limbs are smaller than trunks, usually, and also get smaller until they develop into branches, which again get narrower and narrower until the end. When you draw one or more trees in a landscape, it adds interest to have the trees leaning a bit, not perfectly straight up and down, and to have them vary in size, height, and width. Here are a few samples of some completed sample trees that I have painted. Small practice paintings such as these little studies of trees give you the opportunity of testing out colors and wetness of your brush to get certain effects. They allow you to try different papers so that you can see what effect they will have doing your tree. And each time you practice, you're going to become a better painter. The method of painting trees I'm going to share with you today actually doesn't require you to draw entire trees, but only the trunk and the start of a few limbs. No foliage or additional limbs and branches are sketched. I'm going to do my little drawing as a sample of how I begin my trees for painting by using a fine line Sharpie marker so that you can see the drawing. However, when I sketch onto my watercolor paper, I will be using a number 2 pencil with light pressure. I'm going to begin with my trunk, and as you notice, I'm going to be starting over to the left of center. This is to allow me to decide whether I want to make another painting and add elements, or simply add another practice tree to my paper. I start with a rather rough, jiggly line, because this is going to be an old oak tree. It's going to have some wear showing. And I like to also have a little area at the bottom of the trunk to maybe indicate where the root has come above ground level. I'm going to continue on with the limbs, and we have areas where I actually don't put anything. I leave it blank. This is going to be where foliage is going to fill in. I enjoy doing trees, especially ones that have some age on them. They're usually very interesting, and you can jiggle those lines, and the old saying, I can't draw a straight line, in this case is probably for the better. I have 4. I like to have uneven numbers, so I'm going to put in a 5th limb up here. And there I have my basic sketch. I'm going to go ahead and put another tree onto my watercolor paper and rejoin you, and then let's paint together. I have my sketch on my watercolor paper. Again, I'm using a quarter sheet of 140-pound cold press paper. Arches paper comes in both natural and bright white. This is bright white, although oftentimes natural, which has a slightly ecru cast to it, is great for landscapes. But today I want some bright clear colors, and the bright white's going to work for me. The first thing I'm going to do is activate the colors I'm going to be using right now, which include the sap green, the Hansa yellow lemon, a little bit of the ultramarine blue, just in case I'm going to activate the burnt and the raw sienna and the alizarin crimson. The reason I do this is because sometimes I'm not sure how a color is mixing, and this gives me some more options ready to use. Rinsing my brush well, and I'm using a number 16 round, rather large, but it holds lots of water. It is a natural fiber brush. And I'm just going to randomly put clear water over my paper. No real pattern necessarily. You may have one in mind. If I've left any blank spots in those limbs, I'm going to make sure there is water there. I'm going to extend out beyond where I have ended the limbs, because this is the area where branches are going to be put in. I have my salt and tea ready in case I decide to use those. If you want to check where your water is, just simply put the paper where the light will hit it so that you can see what kind of coverage you have. I'm going to start with the Hansa Yellow Lemon, and I'm going to drop it in near the top. This is where the light, the sunshine, is going to be hitting the foliage. So I might want it the brightest there. I'm going to come in with a little bit of the raw sienna. Tone that yellow down just a hair where there might be some shadows. You can see this process goes pretty quickly. Now for some sap green. This is the Dick Blick sap green. It's a little toned down compared to some saps. That just simply depends upon your taste on what you feel green should look like. If you have a brighter green and want to tone it down, just add a little bit of burnt sienna on your palette and it will tone it down. Okay. Now I am going to add a little bit of the burnt sienna. Just maybe some summer leaves that are turning a little bit dry. Finally, if you're feeling like you want some more shadow areas, go to your ultramarine blue. And when it mixes with your sap green, it'll create a darker green that can be shadows. If it looks too blue while you're painting and you're thinking, uh-oh, don't worry. Rinse your brush off, grab some more of that sap, and just put it right into that ultramarine blue. It will mix it and create a darker green. At this point, I'm going to pick up my paper and see if I can get some of those colors to run just a bit. I'm going to pull this over to the edge. I think that will add a little more interest to my slanty little tree. I did a little bit of blowing there. This is sometimes fun to do. If it goes too far, just wipe it up. Now I'm going to take a dry or I should say just slightly damp. And I'm going to pull some of these areas out to be wispy little brown. This is a form of dry brush. And makes those edges a little uneven. And now I'm going to drop in some salt. This is just regular table salt. There are other types. You can use coarse salt, but I would suggest dampening it lightly before you put it onto the painting. Margarita salt. Experiment. See what happens. And now I'm just going to leave this here. In fact, I'm not even going to use any tea, I don't think. I'm going to leave the salt to activate. And again, do not use a hairdryer if you're using salt. You need to let it simply dry naturally. So let's just let this sit for a while and see what happens. This is a close-up of the foliage area I've just painted and had sprinkled some salt on. It is completely dry at this point. And I wanted you to see the texture that the salt has allowed to come into, almost looking like little leaves. Also where the hard lines and soft lines have come about, sort of unintentionally, but they'll always do that. Salt should be removed as soon as possible. And how you do that is I just use an old inactive credit card that's been cut, and I just gently scrape the surface. I don't like to use my hands because again that can leave oils, and it's just not a very good idea. It's pretty rough also to get those fingers into that. Once I have it collected in a little area, I simply take it to a trash can and scoot it off. So now that you've seen that, let's go ahead and back up and talk about doing the trunk. For this part of the painting, I'm going to be deciding if I have a sun side to the trunk area. This will add dimensionality rather than having everything the same value. Since apparently this is a lighter area, I'm going to assume my sunshine is coming this way. So even though this will be somewhat shadier, where the canopy of the foliage is over the trunk, I'm going to bring in some lights down here. I'm going to start off with a little bit of raw sienna, and I've already made sure that everything was activated, and I'm not going to put this in too darkly. I'm just going to kind of gently get it on that sun side of my tree. Next I'm going to bring in a little bit of the burnt sienna, and I'm going to start actually over here on the shadier side of the tree. And where the two colors mix, I'm just going to let them do that. I'm not going to get too excited about what they're doing. And I am going to pull up the burnt sienna into these foliage areas and actually start putting in the base of some of those limbs that I had sketched in there. Don't be afraid to leave a few white spots that will be your sky holes or the background. I actually do pull the color into the foliage because sometimes it diffuses a little bit of that color. Still nice and wet. There's still a lot of movement of color. I'm going to take a little bit of the ultramarine blue and just gently, while this is wet, drop it into that burnt sienna. It's going to make a dark, shadowy, bluish, brownish color. And that's exactly what I'm looking for right now. And I'm going to keep pulling the ultramarine blue down the shadow side of my tree. You can mix in a little additional burnt sienna to make it even darker. I'm going to reach in again to the raw sienna and have it blend in this area also. If you want to put a little different in, a little alizarin crimson can sometimes add a bit of interest. I'm going to take that little credit card that I had, and I'm going to use it to somewhat scrape some of these marks, and use the sharp corner where I've cut it to add some texturing to the tree. Some of this won't be visible until it dries. You can continue painting a little bit after the striations are put in there. You'll simply capture some of the movement of your paint. Remember, watercolor dries 10 to 15% lighter than when it is wet. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and just let this sit for a bit. Now I'm going to begin to think about the limbs coming from this trunk area. They have started here, but I want you to imagine that they are disappearing into some of the foliage, only to a brief look at them through some of the foliage. You're not going to be drawing a completely straight limb out here. Your original sketch at this point either may be covered up, or it just may not be relevant to where some of the lights and darks are, because I like to bring out my limbs where there's a lighter area in the painting. And again, as I said, sometimes these are unplanned things and you're just going to have to maybe go with what you have. I'm going to start with the burnt sienna, and I'm just going to sort of pull it and pretend this limb is growing out. And it's going to get smaller and smaller. While it's wet, I'm going to get a little bit of the ultramarine blue and drop in. And if you find that the color is too dark, simply rinse your brush out, take the extra water out of it, and pick up some of that color. I also tend to not want to have a very straight edge, so this is going to come out just a little bit. Here I have another limb. This one's not going to pop out till further up here. A little ultramarine blue, just to give some shadow look. If you see a blunt end that you don't care for, just pull it out a little bit more. We're going to be attaching some branches pretty soon. This was the branch that sort of came down, if you'll remember. I'm going to extend that out right there a little bit. A little ultramarine blue. And I'm going to lift some of that extra paint so it'll blend up here. Blends very nicely. This one here is going to come back. It's going to be a little bit into this area here. I'm adding a limb here. And it's going to come out about here. A little bit of a wiggle to that, and here. Same pattern, ultramarine blue. I'm really going to darken it right in that point where they meet. This is going to be a dark area. And clean dampen brush. Lift a little bit of that sunny side off. To make those a little more interesting, I'm going to make a few smaller limbs. Just coming out from perhaps this one. And it's going to branch off a bit. This is where you can let the painting direct you somewhat, letting go of some of your preconceived notions maybe, and put some of these smaller limbs going into branches. When it looks like you have an empty spot. That you don't care for, put something in. This, of course, is a number 8 round that I'm using. And I'm pretty much going to say that's enough for limbs. I'm going to let those dry just a bit and then come in and we'll be working with some fine branches. We've now reached the point when we are going to be putting in the small little branches at the end of these limbs. My first suggestion is not to go too high into the foliage. Keep it down at least by about, a quarter of a third of the area of the foliage. My second is not to overdo the small branches. Very few will be able to give the effect. People know it's a tree and they'll know there's some small branches, so don't overdo it and make this end area very busy. My favorite brush is the number 2 round, and I'm going to mix my burnt sienna with some of my ultramarine blue and get myself a very dark brown. I suggest you have a piece of your practice paper nearby to practice, and all you have to do is set your brush down and gently squiggle up, and you'll get your little tiny branches. Practice is the best way to develop this technique. You almost have to flick the brush, and that will do the trick. So I'm just going to put a few in just to give us the idea that this tree has some little branches popping out. Just be sure they get thinner toward the ends. And that's probably all I'm going to do. And basically our tree is done. Let's take a moment and take a closer look. Our tree is about 90% completed now, and this is the point that I do call the dance. It's the point where we have to decide, much as in ballroom dancing, whether the painting is going to lead or the artist is going to lead. And sometimes it really helps to have some cropping L's. You can make them from bond paper to old mats, but what they enable you to do is to focus on different areas of your painting so that the extra sides do not distract you from what you're really concentrating on. As I've cropped this in, I'm decided that I'm going to be darkening some of the shadow areas with the same method that I used initially. I'm just going to put in some wets, and I'm going to drop in some darker green, which will be sap mixed with a little ultramarine. I'm also going to take the opportunity to put a little detail in. There's this little bump over here, and I'm going to just make that into a little scar from an old limb that maybe has been removed from my old oak tree. So I'm going to speed this process up so that we don't take any additional time, but you are very aware of the technique that I'm using. So let me go ahead and go to that part of the painting. I'm pretty much done with my tree now, but I don't want to leave it hanging there in space. I want to put some ground in here, perhaps some grasses, so that it has a anchor into my painting. Even though this is a practice, I want you to remember that these exercises are the wonderful time to explore and experiment with techniques and practice what you've learned. So don't just leave it half done. Give some finality to it, even if it's only going to be a practice piece that gets filed away or the back of it used for another practice. So I'm going to speed the next process up, and I'll join you when that's done. Well, I feel that my tree study painting is done. I hope you've enjoyed painting with me, and I want to remind you that when you do studies and sample classroom paintings, that if they turn out well, save them. Mat them, frame them. They make wonderful gifts, and they can also be put together, several of them, in a beautiful photo wall that's strictly and uniquely yours. I hope you will join me again on my YouTube channel, Magalia Rose Studio, or visit me online at my website, magaliarose.com. Thank you until we paint together again.